Well, hello, boys and girls. It's your favourite grumpy granny from Grogu's Patch, and I'm back once again. But today, I'm not going to do what I usually do. Today, I thought I'm going to try something different, and I'm going to present a story. Some of you may already be aware that I'm actually adopted. One advantage of being adopted is that over the years, I have had twice the amount of family trees to research. Now, this also means I have twice the amount of interesting stories from history that I have come across organically while doing that research. When deciding which story I was going to present to you for my first foray into this area on YouTube, there was only one logical choice, and that was a story that blew me away when I came across it when I was doing my research. This story is about my great-great-grandfather Henry Goldsmith and his wife Mary Ann, and her surname was Tolman. Now, Henry and Mary Ann, I'm going to put a picture of them here, raised 10 children to adulthood. Now, we're talking late 1800s here, and that was quite a feat back then to actually have all of their children survive to adulthood. As well as the 10 children that they had, they did also take in their eldest granddaughter and raised her as their own. And in doing this, they took on the Australian legal system as it was back in 1907, 1909 and changed the family law system as we know it today. And it's a case that was still being cited as a precedent over 100 years later. So it's quite something. I'll first give you a basic background into the family's history, so you have a little context for the main part of the story. Born in March 1848 in Gorey, County Wexford in Ireland, Henry Goldsmith was the fourth son of William Goldsmith and Anne Wall. Now, at the age of 19, Henry boarded the Canterbury sailing ship, which arrived at Port Phillip Bay on 19th of December 1867. Several of his siblings also emigrated to Australia during the 1860s. In 1875, Henry came to this area where I currently live. Donald is the town that I live in now, but I grew up on a farm in an area outside of Donald called Corak, and it was here that Henry selected some farming land and he began successfully farming in conjunction with his brother James. In October 1876, he married Mary Ann Tolman, and over the next 21 years they had a family of 10 children. The children of Henry and Mary Ann were, in order of birth, Emily, born in 1877, who remained a spinster her whole life. Mary Ann in 1878. She is also a main character in this story. Lavinia in 1880. Alicia Jane, who is my great-grandmother, was born in 1881. Then Florence Matilda in 1883. William Henry in 1886. Annie Melinda in 1889. Then there were twins, Lillian May and Oliver Matthew, in 1894, and the baby of the family, Ivy Evelyn, who was born in 1897. Now, Henry was very community-minded, and he had a very enterprising spirit. By the late 1890s, he had served several terms as a local shire councillor and was even president of the shire for quite a few years. He was very proud of his achievements, and he was proud of his family, and he provided the very best for his children. His hard work over the years paid off, and he'd accumulated quite a bit of wealth. And it was because they were quite affluent, the children were educated by a governess prior to local schools being built. And the household had a cook and a housemaid, which meant the family lived in relative comfort back in the day. Now, this can be seen in an article published in the local Donald Times newspaper on 17th of April 1897, which described the marriage and celebrations when the very first of his children married. And this is Mary Ann that I mentioned before. So this is his second daughter. And if you see my arm moving a lot, my kitty cat is on my lap and is keeps on, pummeling me, wanting to have a pat. I've got the article brought up on screen for you so you can read along with it and see what I'm reading. Now, this is from the Donald Times on the 20th of August, 1897, and the heading was Marriage at Corak, and underneath it said a mammoth gathering. The marriage of Miss Mary Ann Goldsmith, second daughter of Mr. Henry Goldsmith of Wexford Park, Banyonong, President of the Shire of Donald, with Mr. Alexander Sands of Corak, sixth son of the late Mr. Sands of Corak North, was celebrated on Tuesday afternoon last at the bride's parents' residence, the Reverend Mr. Nye, Wesleyan minister, from Wycheproof officiating. Fully 100 friends and relations of the bride and bridegroom were present at the ceremony, the room being prettily decorated for the occasion. Now, they had the ceremony in the house. They had quite a large house, and this is what it looked like. There's I haven't got a lot of photos of it, but this is what it looked like, and you can see it's quite long. I believe they kept adding to it over time as they needed to, as their family grew. You can see it's quite large. They must have had some quite large rooms for this to happen to have 100 guests inside for the ceremony. Right, let's get back to it. The bride, who was given away by her father, looked charming in a lovely cream delaine dress trimmed with cream lace and ribbon, with the usual wreath and veil and orange blossoms. The dress was made by Mrs. E. Poole and did credit to her establishment. The bridesmaids were Miss Lavinia Goldsmith, sister of the bride, and Miss Elizabeth Sands, sister of the bridegroom. Miss Goldsmith was attired in a pretty dress of sea green cashmere with ribbon to match. Miss Sands wore a becoming dress of grey cashmere, trimmed with grey and pink silk, with ribbons and ornaments. Mr. Frank Sands, brother of the bridegroom, was best man. Mr. Frank Sands also went on later in that same year, to marry another one of Henry's daughters. So 2 brothers married 2 sisters. After the ceremony, the bridal party assembled in a large barn, and the wedding breakfast was partaken of. The toast to the bride and bridegroom was proposed by Reverend Mr. Nye, who, in a few well-chosen remarks, wished the newly married couple success and happiness, and hoped they would live long and never regret the day they were united. Mr. Sands responded on behalf of himself and his wife and thanked all present for the good wishes expressed for himself and bride. Mr. George Bignell proposed the toast of the bride's parents with a neat little speech, the toast being ably responded to by Mr. Goldsmith. The toast of the bridesmaids was proposed by Mr. Charles Campbell and responded to on behalf of the ladies by Mr. Frank Sands. Apparently it wasn't the done thing for the ladies to make any speeches. The article goes on. Never before in this district had such a gathering assembled at a wedding party as that which gathered at Mr. Goldsmith's residence on Tuesday night. The wedding breakfast commenced at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and was not concluded until 9 at night. Over 400 persons partaking of the good things provided by the host and hostess, and no expense was spared in providing eatables of first-class order. So extra people came out to go to the actual wedding breakfast, which was held in the barn after the ceremony. And what I believe happened was all the food was in the house, so people went into the house to get their food and then came back out to the barn where the actual party was. Every room in the commodious residence was crammed to its utmost by friends, people coming from all parts and directions of the district. Nothing was wanting to make the gathering a success, everyone enjoying themselves to their utmost, and many a year will pass before the wedding day of Mr. and Mrs. Sands will be forgotten. The night's amusement was kept up until 6 o'clock on Wednesday morning, when the company dispersed, tired with their jubilations, but grateful to the host for the trouble and expense he had undergone to provide amusement. During the evening, many small banquets were held, and the health of Mr. and Mrs. Goldsmith drunk. But one which needs special comment was when Mr. Goldsmith wished all who were fortunate enough to cram in the room to drink to the christening of his residence. For 25 years he had lived there, and in all that time had neglected to give his home a name. He intended to name it that night, and the name chosen was Wexford Park. Now, you may remember Henry came from Wexford County, so that's where the name came from. On many occasions, Mr. and Mrs. Goldsmith were thanked by groups for the kind manner in which they had provided for all present. Songs, dances, etc. were rendered during the evening, the music being principally supplied by the Misters Hall on violin. The bride and bridegroom left for Berwick yesterday, where they intend residing. The presents were both costly and numerous, as will be seen by the list published hereunder. And then there's a big long column, nearly goes the full length of the newspaper, showing all the gifts, but I'm not going to read those out for you. Following their grand wedding, Alexander and Mary Ann Sands made their home in Berwick, which was another country town some distance from Corac. Alexander was a farmer there, and there was great excitement in the family when Mary Ann became pregnant within months of the marriage. The living conditions at Berwick were quite basic compared to what Mary Ann had grown up with at Wexford Park, and so she returned to her childhood home at Corac to give birth to a daughter, Gladys Ethel, in July of 1898. After a suitable lying-in period, Mary Ann returned to Berwick with Gladys and her eldest sister Emily, who went along to help as Mary Ann began the next exciting stage of life. However, things didn't go as planned. Sadly, the Reverend Mr. Nye's words did not come to fruition when tragedy struck, and this was reported by the Donald Times article on the 9th of December 1898. The article is headed Death of Mrs. A. Sands. Death generally creates a gloom at any season or time in every community, but never before did Corac and District experience such a shock as at the announcement of the lamentable death of Mrs. Alex Sands, who expired after a short illness brought on by the prevailing disease, measles, at her residence, Berrowillick, at 10 minutes past 7 on Monday morning. Now, keep in mind that the Sandses and the Goldsmiths were neighbours, and so that was a lot of people in their immediate area that this affected. The deceased lady had been ill for a few days with measles, but her friends and nurses did not anticipate anything serious. Unhappily, however, on Monday morning, she became alarmingly ill and passed away conscious and peacefully. Mrs. Goldsmith, and that's Mary Ann, her mother, was on her way to her daughter, but arrived too late to see her alive. The great shock Mrs. Goldsmith received has placed her in the hands of the doctor at Berrowillick. The eldest sister, Emily, who was staying with the deceased, is also prostrated, of Mr. R. Sands, from whose place the funeral cortege left on Tuesday at 3:30 p.m. for the Corac Cemetery. The procession of vehicles and horsemen was the largest seen at Corac for some time. In fact, it was astonishing how the multitude had learned the sad news in time to show the great respect they had for the deceased. The scene at the grave was a most impressive one. The funeral service was read by Mr. T.R. Bevan of Corac in the absence of the local clergyman, Mr. A. Sands, the husband, Mr. H. Goldsmith, the father, and Mr. J. Goldsmith, uncle, were the nearest relatives able to be present, the others all being down with sickness. That's a bit sad, isn't it? Great sympathy is expressed for the young bereaved husband and parents, and for all the sorrowing brothers, sisters, and friends. As lamentable as the death was, I'm sure that the writer of this article wouldn't have imagined that over 100 years later, the consequences of this death would still be discussed in legal circles. At the time of his wife's death, Alexander Sands made the decision to leave his infant daughter in the care of his parents-in-law. Life did move on for Alexander, who returned to Berrowillick and married again in 1899. He rarely saw Gladys, who enjoyed growing up in the comfort of Wexford Park. By 1907, Alexander and his second wife, Lucy Perry, had 4 children of their own. By now, Gladys was 9 years old. And according to the oral family history passed down, it was thought that he may have been thinking that Gladys would be a useful addition to his household, because he started to make attempts to have Gladys return to him full time. At the start of 1907, Henry and Mary Ann sent Gladys to have an extended visit of 2 weeks with her father and his family at Berrowillick. Henry was shocked at the servant-like behaviour Gladys exhibited on her return home and noticed that she had lost quite a bit of weight. He determined that her father only wanted Gladys for her housekeeping and childcare abilities and refused to allow her to return. And I'm sure it must have been quite a shock for Gladys, going from what she went from Wexford Park to going to the Sands household and expected to do chores and help look after the children. Once he realised that the Goldsmiths would not allow Gladys to go back to Berrowillick, Alexander Sands mounted a legal case to get custody of his daughter. I'm sure this would have created more than a little discomfort at Corac, as the Sands and Goldsmith families were next door neighbours, as I said before, and by then one of his brothers, Frank, had married Lavinia, Mary Ann's sister. Details of this case was widely reported, including this article published in the Melbourne Herald on the 14th of August 1907. So Alexander applied for full custody of Gladys, and as you'll hear in this story, that was originally knocked back. So then he appealed the decision, and we'll find out what happened then. So this heading is custody of a child, father or grandparents. Full court decision. Father's rights upheld. The full court, consisting of Chief Justice, Mr. Justice Beckett and Mr. Justice Hood, today delivered on an appeal from judgment of Mr. Justice in a case concerning custody of a child. The appellant was Alexander Sands of Berrowillick, farmer, and he seeks the custody of his daughter, Gladys Ethel Sands, 9 years of age, who is now being cared for by her grandparents. The mother of the child and wife of the appellant died on 5th of December 1898, and the child was then handed over to the care of the wife's parents, Mr. Henry Goldsmith, a farmer residing at Corac, and Mrs. Mary Goldsmith, his wife. The father had visited the child without any objection. 12 months after the death of his first wife, the appellant married again, and the issue of the second marriage was 4 children, the eldest being 6 years old and the youngest 3 months old. Application was made in the first instance to Mr. Justice Hodges. His Honour held that the child should remain with the grandparents, remarking that she appeared to be very well cared for by them. Her position was assured, and if she were taken away from that certainty, he thought he would be placing her in a position of uncertainty and risk. The father appealed from this decision on the ground that the primary judge was wrong in law in refusing to order that the child should be given to the father's custody, and that on the evidence he was entitled to have care of the child entrusted to him. The Chief Justice, in delivering the decision of the full court, said that it was not considered that the father was not in a position to care for his child in the way she should be cared for. He was in a good position and was well able to maintain her. There was no objection raised in respect to the stepmother, who appeared to be a woman who could care for the child. The grandparents had no doubt grown fond of the child and were loath to part with her. There was, however, a rule of law which laid down the principle that unless good reason should be shown to the contrary, a father was entitled to the custody of his child. When the child reached the years of discretion, which in some cases had been placed at 15 years, she was entitled to choose where and with whom she should reside. The child, the subject of the present case, was well within the period of life in which the father was entitled to have her in custody. In handing over the child to the grandparents, the father, the court was of the opinion, did a wise thing. But now, as his fortunes had changed, he wanted the child back, and the court thought he should have her. Therefore, following the authorities in such cases, they thought the appeal should be allowed. The father had his rights and had successfully vindicated them, but it was owing to emergency in which he found himself that the present difficulty arose. The grandparents thought they had a right to keep the child, and in the circumstances no costs would be allowed. On the application of Mr. Bryant on behalf of the respondents, a stay of proceedings for 14 days was granted to enable them to decide whether they should appeal to the High Court or not. Mr. Irvine, KC, and Mr. McFarlane, instructed by Messrs. S. Williams and Heathfield, appealed for appellant, and Mr. Bryant, instructed by Mill and Oakley, for the respondents. So basically, the court then said that according to the law, as it was then, Gladys should be handed back over to the father. Thankfully, the Goldsmith solicitor applied for a stay of the proceedings, so they didn't have to hand her back for 2 weeks, enabling them a chance to appeal to the High Court. And yes, they did appeal to the High Court. So let's see what happens next. Some of these newspapers have come down through being digitised and are a little faded, but still readable. So this article was published in the Bendigo Advertiser on the 30th of September. Custody of a child. The High Court was called upon last week to decide an appeal case with regard to the custody of a child. The case, which presented some features of interest, has been the subject of considerable litigation. It appears that on the death of the wife of a farmer named Alexander Sands of Berrowillick, his infant daughter Gladys was handed over to her grandparents, the parents of the deceased mother, Henry and Mary Ann Goldsmith of Corac. This was in December 1898, and in November 1899 Sands married again, and there were 4 children of this second marriage. With the exception of a visit to her father for 3 weeks in 1900, the daughter of the first wife has resided with her grandparents since December 1898, nearly 9 years. Recently, however, the father endeavoured to obtain custody of the daughter, and on the case being heard before Mr. Justice Hodges, he decided that, in view of the second family and of the father having abdicated his rights, as in by leaving her with the grandparents and not visiting, the child ought not to be removed from the grandparents' custody. That judgment was reversed by the full court, and an appeal was then made to the High Court. Mr. Justice Griffiths has delivered judgment which meets with the concurrence of Mr. Justice Barton and Mr. Justice O'Connor, Mr. Justice Higgins dissenting, and the decision is that the child shall remain with the grandparents. Going with the original judgment of Mr. Justice Hodges, good bloke Mr. Justice Hodges, being thus upheld. No doubt the decision will be questioned, but under the circumstances, it is almost certain that the balance of opinion will be in favour of the judgment at which the High Court has arrived. Under ordinary circumstances, the father would undoubtedly have had the best right to the child. As Chief Justice Griffiths said, the right of the father to the custody and control of his children is one of the most sacred rights, a right which could only be abrogated on the advancement of some sufficient proof that he is unfit to have charge of any child, or by course of conduct indicates that a resumption of his authority would lead to his becoming capricious or cruel to his children. In the case under notice, Sands had apparently abandoned his right. The removal of the child to the residence of the grandparents on the death of the mother was no doubt absolutely necessary, and that fact in itself would not have affected the claim of the father if he had desired her return to him on his remarriage. He did not do so, however, but allowed her to remain with her grandparents for nearly 9 years. In the meantime, he married again, and at the time he expressed the desire to have the child under his roof again. He was the father of 4 other children by his second marriage. The grandparents, having no doubt become deeply attached to the child, who returns their affection, affirmed in answer to the writ that it was not for the interest or welfare of the child that she should be handed back to her father, and that he had abandoned his right to the care and custody of her. This contention is supported by the fact that the father allowed the child to remain for nearly 9 years with her grandparents, although in the meantime he had remarried and was in a position to give her a home and bring her up. That he should suddenly proceed to assert his rights in regard to her suggests the possibility that he saw that she would now be of some use in his household after the grandparents had had all the care and responsibility of her in her tenderest years. Evidently, the Chief Justice took this view because he expressed the opinion that the resumption of the father's authority would be capricious and cruel towards the child, and that it was clear her happiness would be greatly interfered with by the proposed change. The Chief Justice was also convinced that the father had deliberately abandoned the child in 1900. So far as the reports of the case disclose, there was no evidence as to whether the father had contributed to the child's support during the 9 years. No, he didn't. Or had discharged any obligations as a parent. Apart altogether from that aspect of the question, there is little doubt that the affection subsisting between the child and her grandparents transcended the affection subsisting between her and her father. And if the decision had been in favour of the father, the wrench to the grandparents and to the child would have been much more severe than it can possibly be to the father, if indeed there is any wrench to him under the circumstances. And that, my friends, is why this was such a big decision. It was new because up until this happened, the usual practice was to grant custody in favour of the father, unless there was mitigating circumstances such as he was of bad character or is an alcoholic, etc. This was the case often even when a father applied to take a child out of its existing custody after a lapse of years. However, this was a landmark decision by the High Court and, of course, by the initial judgment by Justice Hodges, and because the powers that be not only considered the previous conduct and character of the father, and that being not that he was of bad character, but that he had basically ignored her all those years, but they also took into account the welfare of the child and what effect removing the child from the existing living arrangements would have made. And how did this affect the Goldsmith family? Well, I can tell you this, that leading up to this time, Henry had already been expanding his farming interests and looking into other areas where he could keep his business growing. And there came a scheme in Queensland where farmers could apply to take up selections on what they were called prickly pear selections along the Condamine River. And Henry sent us one of his neighbours, the son of one of his neighbours actually, young Mr. Riley, sent him up to check everything out. He reported back. And so the Goldsmith group, which was Henry and several other Korak families, they actually took up prickly pear selections. And this is in the Darling Downs district of Queensland. Henry himself went to Condamine sometime in 1907, and after arranging the construction of a classic Queenslander home, moved the family to Queensland around 1909. And I'll tell you a bit more about the house in a sec. It is believed that the decision to move the family interstate was partially brought about in an effort to remove Gladys from all the drama of the court case and also increase the distance between the Goldsmiths and Alexander Sands. And I'm happy to say that the story of the Goldsmiths move to Queensland was successful and is a whole other story for another time. Let's go back to the Queenslander house, which I'm going to show you a picture of here as it was when it was built. Now, I'm also going to show you some pictures of what it was in, I think, 2010. Brittany, my daughter, and I, we actually went up to Condamine to visit with relatives that were still living on the property where Henry had originally been farming. And I'm going to also show you some pictures of still some existing railing, wooden fencing and stuff that they had there, that's all sort of left in one part. And we were actually able to go and visit the house, which is still standing. It's been renovated and changed a little bit, but yeah, there it is, still standing. And they took us inside, and you'll be able to see here, there's pictures of this table. This is the original Goldsmith table that was built in there, was assembled in that kitchen. And it's so long because, of course, there were so many kids and their partners, etc., that over time, even when there's been new people living in the house, it's been too big for them to remove even if they wanted to. Not that anyone's actually wanted to, I don't think. Although I think one lot did try to remove it and couldn't. So there's pictures of the table that Henry himself and Gladys and Marianne and other family members all sat at. How amazing is that? So just as a closing, I'll just say a few things. Goldsmith versus Sands laid the basis for determining how the custody of children should be decided, giving preference to the welfare of the child over the father's parental rights. One only has to Google the case to find numerous references to it, right up to 2003, when it was referenced as a precedent in the case of Catanac and another versus Melchor and another. It was even discussed in a 2006 paper authored by Colin James entitled Winners and Losers, the Father Factor in Australian Child Custody Law in the 20th Century. Henry Goldsmith died on the 1st of February 1925 at the hutch overlooking Lake Wendouree, back in Victoria, not anywhere near Corac, but back in Victoria. But the key thing is here, on his death, he wanted to be sure that Gladys would be on equal footing with his own children. And his will was dated on the 18th of December 1922. And his will actually states, and I'll put the will up here for you, but I'll also interpret it for you. It says, I declare that in the interpretation of this my will, the expression or expressions, word or words, my children, daughter, or my daughters shall, where the context permits, be taken to include my grandchild Gladys Ethel Sands, the child of my deceased child Mary Annie Sands, it being my intention that the said Gladys Ethel Sands shall be considered as one of my own daughters in the interpretation of this my will. You may be very interested to know what happened to Gladys and how she lived her life, but for that you're going to have to wait, because that's also a story for another time. Because that is a story. In the end, I just want to say I'm very, very proud that my great-grandparents fought for Gladys and what was going to be best for her, and for forging a path for the family law courts to follow. And, you know, this became even more so a special thing for me when I was going through my own divorce and custody issues. So I appreciate, I'd already been through the custody issues when I came across all this information, and it blew me away that, you know, my kids could get their own solicitor when their father applied for extra custody and they didn't want to go. And they were able to get their own solicitor to represent them. They told them what they wanted. He represented them in court. And in the end, their welfare and what they wanted was more important than what the father's parental rights were. And I have my great-grandfather to thank for that, although I didn't know it at the time. So that's it, boys and girls. I hope you've enjoyed this little foray into history. Please let me know in the comments if you did, and if you want to hear more interesting stories, because there are plenty of them, and some of them are quite interesting. There's even a fight where someone tries to murder someone else with an axe. So, yeah, let me know if you want to hear more, and I will gladly accept that little challenge and give you more. Bye now.